Team Fortress 2 is a pretty old game. It's been around for 16 years, and no game stays popular for that long without its fair share of balance changes. It's been a while since the last major batch of balance changes, and I feel like a large number of items on the weapon roster are in desperate need of a rework. So without further ado, here's 4 major TF2 balance changes the game needs. Number 1. Right out of the gate, I'm going to mention what I think is the worst case of imbalance in the current state of the game. The Medic's Ubersaw is just too good compared to all the other options. In all honesty, the Ubersaw isn't even particularly overpowered, it's just that all the other options are much worse. Here's what I think needs to happen. First, lower the Uber percentage gained by the Ubersaw from 25 to 20. I feel like this is a small enough difference that most of the time losing the 5% won't matter all that much, but it's still a significant enough change to make the other melees less overshadowed. Secondly, the other options need buffs to help them match the Ubersaw's power. I personally believe that the Solemn Vow is pretty underrated and doesn't need a buff at all, but as for the other melees, these are my ideas. The Amputator's Taunt should heal for more. Right now, the Amputator's Taunt does a decent job at healing your team, but it's not strong enough to be worth using over the Medigun most of the time. With just a small healing boost, it could be really powerful. The Vitasaw needs a full rework. In the state it's in right now, it's more of a safeguard than an actual tool, and I find that extremely boring. Sure, it might not be that bad, but you can't tell me you'd rather use this thing over any of the other options. Anyways, I think it'd be really cool if instead of retaining Uber on death, there was a mechanic where the more organs you've collected, the faster your Medigun builds Uber charge. That would make the weapon just so much more dynamic and fun. Lastly, there's the stock Bonesaw, and to be fully honest, I don't think it's possible to fix the Bonesaw. It requires either nerfing all the other options into the ground or buffing a stock melee, which just doesn't seem right. So as much as it might need a buff, the Bonesaw has to stay the same. And that's it for the medic melees. Obviously it seems pretty unlikely that we're going to get a balance patch anytime soon, but if we did, I think this is the most important area of weapons that needs to be fixed. Anyways, number 2. Random projectile weapons. TF2 has a whole slew of projectile-based weapons that just absolutely suck. This includes stuff like the Palm Synth, the Sandman, and the worst case of them all, the Bison. These weapons are meant to be cool, long-range alternatives for usually short-range weapon slots, but almost all their projectiles are either bugged or just plain terrible. Here's how I think this can be fixed. For the Palm Synth, please increase the projectile speed. The main issue with this pile of garbage is that even though it's supposed to be a long-range projectile, you'll never hit anyone at long range because the projectile is just way too slow. The best range to use this thing at is a close range, and at that point you'd be better off just using a shotgun. I say one of 2 changes has to be made. Either massively buff the projectile speed to make this the long-range blaster it was meant to be, or change the Uber cloak drain to be much stronger to emphasize the utility purpose of this thing. Either way, it desperately needs a buff. And the Sandman also really needs a change. The ball barely does any damage most of the time, and the slow effect is basically non-existent. It's completely bugged in multiple ways, and it can even be completely avoided by just moving diagonally. The problem is, even if they fix the slow effect to work properly, this thing would probably still suck because the slow effect isn't even that game changing. I propose that the Sandman's ball should mark enemies for death like it does in MDM. This way it would actually be beneficial to hit your enemies with the ball, and I feel like this would actually make it powerful enough to warrant the health penalty. Lastly, there's the Bison. There are so many ways to fix the Bison, it baffles me that they haven't done anything already. It definitely needs a damage increase, and I'd say a projectile speed buff as well. But this of course would mean that the multi-hit mechanic is less likely to get extra damage, which is why I would also suggest that the interval between subsequent hits is made shorter. This way the Bison would actually be fun to shoot, and it would be fast, damaging, and still retain its unique multi-hit mechanic. And that's it for the random projectile weapons. Moving on. Number 3, syringe guns. Yep, we're talking about the medic again, just goes to show how unbalanced his toolkit is. The medic's primary slot is almost always reserved for the Crusader's crossbow because of its unique ability to heal teammates from incredibly far distances. What I said about the Ubersaw earlier still applies here. The problem isn't that the crossbow is actually that overpowered, it's actually pretty balanced. The issue is just that the other options are much worse. The stock syringe gun, the Blutsauger, and the overdose all get completely left in the dust, and so here's how I think that can be fixed. First, increase the projectile speed of all the syringes, and at the same time decrease the effect of the gravity on them. One of the biggest downsides of all the syringe guns is that the projectiles are inconsistent and they fall very quickly. This makes it much more difficult to aim at distant targets or even just people at mid-range. With a much higher projectile speed, this wouldn't be nearly as much of an issue, especially with the other change I propose, which is less random spread. These changes would make the syringe guns actually somewhat viable damage dealers, but to maintain balance, their damage output would have to be pretty low. For the Blutsauger specifically, I think with these changes, it would be much more fair and fun to use. Being able to hit your syringes easier means more health would be gained and you'd have more survivability. But for the overdose, which is more centered around the utility of movement speed, I propose an entirely different rework. Instead of gaining an increase in movement speed while equipped, the overdose's boost should be a passive ability and give the increased speed while using the mediguns or the melees as well. Hopefully these changes would make the syringe guns more viable and more fun, but even if this did happen, I think the crossbow would still be the best because the burst healing is just too good. Anyways, number 4. The trash items. This category is for the ultimately useless items that have almost no chance of ever being used practically. I'm talking about the red tape recorder, the man treads, and the caber. There's definitely going to be some people who don't agree with me that these items are terrible, but I think that most people would generally agree that these quote-unquote weapons are almost entirely outclassed. The red tape is just worse than the stock sapper in 95% of scenarios, the caber doesn't even kill light classes, and the man tread's air control will be pretty good for rocket jumping, but no blast resistance means you're either just gonna blow yourself up or die to fall damage. Here's how I would fix these. One interesting balance idea for the red tape recorder is to give it much more health than the stock sapper, say about 66% more, so that it takes 4 wrench hits to remove instead of 2. This would also mean it takes 5 jag hits to remove and 2 homewrecker hits. This way, the red tape recorder would be much more viable, because even though it's too slow to actually destroy any buildings on its own, it could be used with a coordinated team to disable your enemy's building when you push in. I'm not sure how fair this would be, but it would at least make the recorder much more viable and fun to use. For the caber, all it needs is a tiny explosion damage buff, just enough to have it reliably kill light classes, because in its current state, while it is possible to one-shot a light class, it rarely happens due to some luck in how explosion damage is determined. Just increasing the damage a little bit, or changing how the explosion damage is calculated, would make the weapon much better. And lastly, there's the man treads. The issue with these things is their lack of damage protection from rocket jumping. So I propose that we give these things a moderate fall damage reduction stat, around 50% or so, enough that cratering with it is much less common. This would mean that by using a low damage launcher like the Liberty launcher, you could actually make good use of the air control without taking way too much damage. I think this would make them a viable alternative to the gunboats, and actually just much more fun to use in general outside of Trojan. And that's all I have to say for today. There's a couple more weapons that I definitely could have thrown in here, and I might make a follow-up to this video in the future, but for now this is all I got. If you've got your own balance change ideas, feel free to leave them in the comments. And if you liked the video, consider subscribing.